Reverend Samuel Grayson was the beloved preacher of Blackwood, Texas, a man whose sermons offered salvation and whose kindness knew no bounds. But when Emily Carter disappeared without a trace, and a forgotten farmhouse was discovered hiding the bones of other missing women, the town was forced to confront a horrifying truth. Samuel Grayson, the man they trusted, was not a healer of souls, but a cold, calculating predator. Reverend Samuel Grayson was a man admired by many. In the small town of Blackwood, Texas, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a figure of unwavering faith, a man whose words could bring comfort to the grieving and guidance to the lost. For nearly a decade, he had stood at the pulpit of Holy Grace Baptist Church, preaching about love, redemption, and the importance of faith in times of hardship. His voice carried through the town, reaching those who needed it most, and his reputation as a man of God was beyond question. Before coming to Blackwood, little was known about his past. He had arrived from Louisiana, saying only that he had felt a divine calling to serve a new community. He never spoke much about his life before his ministry, and no one thought to ask. He was a kind man, always willing to help those in need, and that was all that mattered to the people of Blackwood. He would visit the sick, counsel troubled couples, and lead charity drives for the less fortunate. When tragedy struck a family, he was the first to offer support. People trusted him. Women confided in him. Over the years, many vulnerable women sought his guidance. Some were victims of abuse, others struggling with depression or personal loss. He welcomed them into his office with open arms, offering them words of reassurance and prayers for healing. He told them they were safe with him, that he would help them find their way back to happiness and faith. His presence was calming, his words persuasive. It was easy to believe that this man, who lived so simply and preached so passionately, was everything he claimed to be. But beneath the image of a devoted preacher, there was something darker, something no one had ever questioned. In Blackwood, women occasionally went missing, but the disappearances never seemed to raise suspicion. A young waitress left town suddenly after breaking up with her boyfriend. A struggling single mother packed her bags and vanished without telling her family. A widowed woman who attended church every Sunday was last seen at the grocery store before disappearing without a trace. Each case was treated as an unfortunate but unconnected event. Some assumed these women had run away to escape their troubled lives, while others believed they had found new beginnings elsewhere. Without evidence of foul play, the cases were quietly forgotten. The town's trust in Reverend Grayson remained unshaken. He was, after all, a man of God. He delivered sermons that touched people's hearts and organized community gatherings that brought people together. If he knew anything about the missing women, he never spoke of it. He continued to preach about faith and salvation, never missing a Sunday, never faltering in his role. No one suspected that the man leading their prayers had his own terrible secrets, hidden behind the pulpit, buried in the darkness of Blackwood's quiet nights. And soon the truth would begin to unravel in the most chilling way imaginable. Emily Carter was the kind of woman who refused to let life break her, even when it tried. At 32 years old, she had been through more than her fair share of hardships. A bitter divorce had left her struggling to provide for her 6-year-old son, Daniel, but she refused to give up. She worked long shifts at the local diner, always putting her son's needs before her own. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all became too much, and in those moments, she turned to her faith for comfort. That was how she found herself at Holy Grace Baptist Church. She had attended services before but had never been deeply involved. After her divorce, however, she began seeking guidance. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of Reverend Samuel Grayson. He noticed her sitting in the back pew, eyes filled with sorrow, and after one Sunday service, he approached her. He offered her words of encouragement, telling her that God had a plan for her, that she wasn't alone. His kindness felt like a lifeline, and soon she began attending private counseling sessions with him. Over the following weeks, Emily confided in the preacher. She told him about the sleepless nights, the fear of failing her son, the loneliness that gnawed at her. He listened patiently, his voice always gentle, his advice always comforting. He told her that faith would guide her through the storm, that she was stronger than she believed. It was the first time in a long while that she felt heard, understood. Then, one evening, she disappeared. Emily had left her son with a friend while she ran errands, promising to be back in an hour. When she didn't return, the friend tried calling her, but there was no answer. At first, there was no immediate panic. Maybe she had lost track of time. Maybe she had car trouble. But as the hours passed, concern turned to fear. By the next morning, Emily was officially reported missing. Her car was found abandoned on a quiet rural road outside of town, keys still in the ignition, purse still inside. The doors were unlocked, and there were no signs of struggle. No shattered glass, no blood, nothing to suggest what had happened to her. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her car and vanished into the night. The police searched the area, questioning friends, co-workers, and neighbors. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. Flyers were posted, search parties organized, but there was no trace of Emily. Rumors spread through Blackwood. Some whispered that she had run away from her problems. Others feared something far worse. Reverend Grayson spoke about her disappearance in church the following Sunday, leading prayers for her safe return. His voice was steady, his expression sorrowful. He urged the congregation to keep faith, to trust that God would bring Emily home. People nodded, reassured by his words. No one knew that the man standing before them was the very reason she was never coming back. The discovery was purely accidental. A group of hunters, deep in the woods on the outskirts of Blackwood, had been following deer tracks when they stumbled upon something unexpected. A crumbling old farmhouse, half hidden by overgrown trees and tangled vines. The structure had clearly been abandoned for years, its windows shattered, the wooden walls warped from time and weather. Curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to take a closer look. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Dust and cobwebs coated every surface, and the wooden floors creaked beneath their boots. It looked like no one had lived there in decades, yet something about the place felt wrong. As they explored further, one of the hunters noticed something strange in a back room. What appeared to be a pile of women's clothing, neatly folded and placed on an old table. Nearby, a rusted trunk sat partially open, revealing locks of hair tied together with ribbons. The sight sent a chill through them, and when they found a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings detailing missing women from Blackwood and neighboring towns, their unease turned to dread. They left immediately, calling the authorities as soon as they had cell service. Within hours, the area was swarming with police, crime scene investigators, and forensic teams. The farmhouse was searched top to bottom, every inch examined for evidence. What they uncovered was worse than anyone could have imagined. Just beyond the property, in a clearing behind the house, investigators found disturbed soil. A deeper search led them to a horrifying discovery: shallow graves. Human remains buried in makeshift plots, some barely concealed beneath the earth. The bones were brittle, the bodies long decomposed, but there was no doubt that these were the missing women Blackwood had seemingly forgotten. Among the remains, DNA testing would later confirm the identities of 3 women, 2 who had disappeared years before, and one that was still fresh in everyone's minds: Emily Carter. The moment her name was confirmed, the town's atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a string of disappearances. It was a murder case, and the man responsible had been living among them all along. Investigators combed through property records, trying to determine who had owned the farmhouse. What they found was chilling. Though the original owner had died years ago, the property had been transferred to Holy Grace Baptist Church, and the only person with access to it was Reverend Samuel Grayson. For the first time, suspicion pointed directly at the beloved preacher. It didn't seem possible. He had been a pillar of the community, a man of faith, a leader. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The clothing, the hair, the news clippings. Who else would have had reason to keep such things? The town of Blackwood had spent years listening to his sermons, trusting his words. But now they faced the horrifying truth. Their preacher wasn't a man of God. He was a monster in disguise. As investigators dug deeper into Reverend Samuel Grayson's past, they began to unravel a chilling pattern that stretched far beyond Blackwood. His history, once mysterious and unexamined, was now under a magnifying glass. And what they found painted a picture of a man who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Before arriving in Blackwood, Grayson had spent time in Louisiana, where he had served as a minister at a small church in a rural town. Records showed that during his time there, two women had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to the cases in Blackwood. Both had been regular churchgoers, both had confided in him about personal struggles, and both had vanished without a trace. At the time, their disappearances had been dismissed as women who had simply left town in search of a new life. But now, investigators were beginning to see the truth. Further searches into Grayson's personal records revealed disturbing details. His previous church had abruptly let him go, though there were no official reasons listed in any documents. When questioned, former church members recalled vague rumors that he had been involved in something inappropriate, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. Instead of facing consequences, he had simply packed his bags and moved on, straight to Blackwood, where no one knew his past. Inside his home, police found even more damning evidence. Hidden in the back of his bedroom closet was a locked wooden box. When investigators pried it open, they discovered an assortment of disturbing keepsakes, small personal items belonging to the victims, rings, bracelets, even a few torn pieces of fabric that appeared to be from their clothing. Each token was a silent reminder of the lives he had stolen, trophies from the women who had trusted him. Even more shocking was a worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten entries detailing his thoughts and actions. Though he never explicitly admitted to the murders in writing, his words revealed a man consumed by control and a twisted sense of power. He wrote about guiding lost souls and helping them find peace, phrases that took on a far more sinister meaning in the wake of the discoveries at the farmhouse. There were cryptic passages referencing the burial site, alluding to it as a sacred place, a place where his work had been completed. The more police uncovered, the clearer it became. Samuel Grayson had been living a double life. By day, he was the town's trusted preacher, delivering sermons about salvation. By night, he was a predator, targeting the very women who came to him for help. His victims weren't random. They were carefully chosen. They were women in vulnerable positions, women who wouldn't immediately be missed, women who had nowhere else to turn. With undeniable evidence piling up, authorities moved quickly. They knew they had to act before he had the chance to run, before he could disappear the way he had done before. The time had come for the preacher to face the truth. The arrest of Reverend Samuel Grayson shook the town of Blackwood to its core. It happened on a Sunday morning, just as the congregation had gathered for worship. The church was full, the usual crowd seated in their pews, waiting for their preacher to begin his sermon. Some bowed their heads in quiet prayer. Others flipped through their hymn books, unaware that outside, police officers were moving into position. The moment Grayson stepped onto the pulpit, the doors burst open. The sight of uniformed officers storming into the church sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Murmurs of confusion filled the room as the officers approached the preacher, their hands hovering near their weapons. Grayson, ever composed, simply lifted his chin, his expression unreadable. The lead detective stepped forward, reading the charges against him, multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. For a moment, the church was silent, the weight of the words sinking in. Then, cries of disbelief erupted. Some of his followers screamed in protest, unable to accept what they were hearing. Others sat frozen in shock, their trust in the man they had revered for years shattering in an instant. Grayson did not fight as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. Instead, he turned to face his congregation one last time, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles, as if he knew something they didn't. Without a word, he allowed himself to be led away, his pristine image crumbling under the weight of the truth. The trial that followed captivated the entire nation. News of the preacher turned serial killer spread far beyond Blackwood, drawing media attention from across the country. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, eager to capture every moment of what was being called one of the most shocking betrayals of trust in modern history. Survivors of his past congregations came forward with disturbing accounts, stories of how he manipulated vulnerable women, how he gained their trust before making them disappear. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their loved ones. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Grayson never showed remorse. He sat calmly throughout the trial, listening as forensic experts detailed the horrors discovered at the farmhouse, as prosecutors presented the items found in his home. The journal, the personal belongings of the victims, the skeletal remains buried behind the farmhouse. It all painted a picture of a man who had spent years hiding behind faith to mask his monstrous nature. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with the verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge wasted no time in handing down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chances, no redemption. Samuel Grayson would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of the power he once held. But even with his conviction, Blackwood would never be the same. The town had lost more than just its preacher. It had lost its sense of security, its blind faith in appearances. The man they had trusted above all had been the very thing they feared most, a predator in disguise. And as the years passed, one question remained unanswered: how many more victims had he left behind, buried in places still undiscovered?